Thank you to Dr. Shiva Prasad for inviting me to this lecture, and I hope I'll be speaking for around 45 to 50 minutes. So that I hope will give us ample time for interaction and questions, which I'd be very happy to kind of respond to. I know that I'm talking to colleagues, and I would, my lecture is based on my book, which has just come out. This is the book. I hope you can see it, Brexit and Liberal Democracy, and I'll be speaking on Brexit and Europe. First of all, let me kind of explain my reasons for writing this particular book. It arose from a deep sense of disquiet when the referendum results came in on the 23rd of June 2016. That's almost 5.5, 6 years ago now. And I think the sense of deep disquiet arose from what I felt was a kind of impending crisis that liberal democracies across the world had started to experience, a certain kind of turbulence that has only got worse in the 5.5, 6 years, to such an extent that people, many people that I read, and also including myself, would suggest that we have what is called a pretty serious crisis of liberal democracy, in the sense that, it is a crisis that we would also call, in a very serious sense, existential. We do not know whether the democracy that we have become so familiar with will continue to be part of the political furniture that we have, people like me and I'm sure many others here have become familiar with. So I don't want to make this sound overly dramatic or apocalyptic in any sense. But what I do want to suggest is that Brexit is one manifestation of a very deep-seated political crisis that the world is going through, that we are experiencing. And of course, my focus will be on Britain, Brexit, and Europe, and the particular reasons why a political trend like Brexit should manifest itself. Now, just as a kind of a bit of historical background for many people who who may not be that familiar with UK politics. I mean, the UK is no longer as important a country as it was 50, 60, 70 years ago when it lost the empire. India, we were the jewel in the crown, the most important colony of the empire. Back in the 1940s, Britain was still the most powerful country in the world. It is no longer as powerful as it was, but it still continues to be a pretty significant country. It's one of the top 5 or 6 richest economies in the world. And the point that I want to make at the very beginning is that Brexit is not just a UK phenomenon. I think it's a kind of a global phenomenon, and that there are many global indicators that Brexit manifests. Now, just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, as when I keep saying this point, that it's not just a UK phenomenon, it's not just an English phenomenon, it's not just a British phenomenon. One of the things that struck me when I was researching the book was that when Brexit happened in 2016, which is also the year that President Trump came to power in the US. I mean, I think these were the 2 big shock events of that particular year, 2016. The Brexit referendum, I think, sent shockwaves not just across Europe, but also across the world. And also the Trump presidential victory, which happened in November of 2016. So as I was saying, when I was researching the book, one thing which struck me and which surprised me was that in a country like China, which we all know is going to become one of the most significant and powerful economies in the world, it's likely to displace the US sometime very soon, the interest in Brexit outstripped in the Chinese media interest in the US presidential victory of Donald Trump. So that's my first benchmark in terms of the kind of ramifications that Brexit has across the world. Now, I say this because we always keep making this point that, of course, the UK is not as important as it was 70 years ago. It's certainly not a superpower. It's what we would call a middling power in terms of purchasing power and certain measures of GDP. India is considered to be above the UK. But that's one of the first things that I would want to foreground in terms of the whole, the significance of Brexit, and why I think in India we should be taking a good look at it. Because one of my concerns has been that in the Indian media, which I find very insular, in the sense that we do not look at the world, we just continue. We are such a big country, and therefore we keep looking at ourselves. But I think it's important for India as a country, especially with such a significant global stature, that we look out to the world increasingly. So I noticed that in the media there was a kind of very attenuated commentary on Brexit. There was a series of articles that I wrote in the Hindu, around 5 or 6 articles as the whole Brexit process unfolded around 2019 to 2020. But by and large, what I was concerned about was this particular fact that we, and as a large country with such a huge global stature, we are perhaps not engaging in with the world or knowing about the world as much as we should be doing, and especially given the kind of very close historical relationships that we have with the UK as a former colonial power. So that's, as I said, my first point. My second point will be in terms of a kind of historical background that I would want to give. Now, the European Union itself is a result of a series of treaties and alliances that have been taking place since 1957. So in 1957, you had the European Coal and Steel Community, which, these processes continued, the Treaty of Rome, as it was called. And then gradually it created the European Economic Community, the Common Market in the 1970s, 1980s. And by 1992, when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, that created the European Union. In 2022, this will be 20 years of the euro, the common European currency being introduced. Now, this I find a very significant development, this kind of a movement in Europe away from the familiar nation state towards a supranational entity that the European Union is. So my point is that when it comes to Brexit and Europe, it's important to understand very significant developments that are happening in Europe after the Second World War. So from 1957 onwards, with the Treaty of Rome, the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, all the way up to 1992, I'm interpreting this as a series of political and economic decisions which are creating what we now know as the European Union, and which is an attempt to transcend the narrowness of the nation state and create a supranational entity that the European Union is. Now, having made that point, let me suggest that Brexit is a reaction to the supranational entity that the EU is, the European Union is. It is a reassertion of the nation state against this particular trend of the supranational entity. So in terms of the historical background that I'm giving, let me just say this once again, that after the Second World War, especially from 1957 onwards, there have been a series of political, economic decisions that have been taken, which I interpret as the attempt within Europe to transcend the narrowness of the nation state and to create a larger supranational entity, the European Union, an entity that exists above the nation state. It is no accident that this should be happening in Europe, because there is a large consensus within most political scientists that Europe was really the place where the entity that we know as the nation state was forged. Some people would trace it to 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. There are political scientists who would want to trace it a little further beyond that. They would go back to 1492, and they would go to the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, when you had the Reconquista. But broadly, the modern category of the nation state, which we are so familiar with, is there's a very significant contribution that Europe has to make in terms of creating the nation state. Now, the thing about a nation state is it is premised upon a certain notion of homogeneity, of one nation and one language and one rule and so on and so forth, which becomes very problematic, especially in the accommodation of religious, ethnic, cultural, linguistic diversity. Now, just a little more in terms of historical background, the Great Britain itself, the United Kingdom, joined the European Economic Community in 1975. Okay, that's almost 46 years ago. There was a referendum in which a majority of people suggested that they actually wanted to join the European Economic Community, and at that time it was felt that the UK would derive great advantages, economic advantages, in terms of joining the European Economic Community. Now, that, of course, was a decision that was reversed 41 years later, when in 2016, the referendum happened in which the UK decided to leave the European Union. It was a very contentious and a very bitterly contested referendum, and I'll have more to say about that. Why did the UK leave the European Union? Now, my own understanding of it is that the reasons for leaving the European Union, the reasons for Brexit, are very legitimate reasons. One can understand the reasons and one can also sympathize with them. But my problem with a phenomenon like Brexit is that the genuineness of those reasons were transformed and transmuted into a general hatred against immigrants and specifically against immigrants. So every time I interpret Brexit, every time I try to understand it, I understand it as the reassertion of a very narrow, insular, provincial English nationalism, not Scottish, not Welsh, not Northern Ireland. Just to kind of disentangle certain categories that can be very confusing. England is just one part of the United Kingdom. There are 4 nations of the UK. There's England, there's Scotland, there's Wales and Northern Ireland. Great Britain itself consists of England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, the relationship with Northern Ireland is a very contentious relationship, Ulster as it's called. There have been accusations of British imperialism in terms of its presence in Northern Ireland. But what I'm kind of bringing up here for your consideration is that there are 2 points. The reasons for leaving the European Union, the reasons why Brexit happened, are genuine, legitimate reasons, and I would want to go into that. However, the tragic irony of Brexit is that the genuineness of those reasons become transformed and transmuted into an extremely narrow, very insular, very provincial, and extremely undesirable hatred against immigrants. And there are many Indian immigrants, of course, in the UK. They are very prominent in political life, especially second, third generation immigrants. The current finance minister, or the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as is called, is a person of Indian origin, Rishi Sunak, who's very bright as a politician. Many people are touting him as the next prime ministerial candidate. He also happens to be the son-in-law of Narayan Murthy, the Infosys head. The Home Minister is someone called Priti Patel, who also has Indian origins. She's from East African. She traces her ancestors to East Africa. Now, what I'm bringing up here for your consideration is, how can something which has a genuine grievance become transmuted into this kind of a hatred? Now, just to give you a sense of how bitter is the hatred and division that Brexit has sown, let me give you an instance of this that you may have read in the news. Now, the Brexit referendum happened on the 23rd of June, 2016, as I said, 5.5 years ago. A week before the vote, before the referendum, in a Northern England constituency of Batley and Spen, that's Yorkshire, a Labour MP was killed by someone on the streets of her constituency. She was stabbed to death by a man who shouted, "Britain first." Now, I'm bringing up this example just to give a sense of how bitter, how contentious, and how divisive electoral campaigns can become. We are witnessing something of that kind in our own country right now, given all this hate speech that we are witnessing and the impending UP elections in Uttarakhand and many other states. Now, my point really is, what we see across the world is election campaigns giving rise to a certain divisiveness and hatred, to the extent that a Labour member of parliament, her name was Jo Cox, was killed on the streets of her own parliamentary constituency by a man shouting, "Britain first." Okay. Once again, this is just kind of meant to give a sense of how bitter, how contentious that election campaign became. Now, the results of the referendum when they came out were pretty shocking, because no one had thought that Britain would really be exiting the European Union. The referendum results were very narrow, 52%, 48%, roughly, that was the division. The other aspect of this election, this referendum, was the way in which many people have suggested that social media was used to manipulate voters. So the use of Facebook, and we are very familiar with Facebook, it's had a pretty bad year in terms of the kind of the ways in which Facebook has been used for targeting people for hatred, in carrying out violence, for example, in neighboring Myanmar, the massacre of Rohingyas. Facebook was used in many other parts of the world. Facebook has been accused of not doing enough to counter hatred on its platform. Now, in much the same way, before the Brexit campaign, Facebook data was harvested to target people in such a way that they could be kind of convinced to vote in a particular direction. Okay, so there was the Leave campaign and there was the Remain campaign. The Leave campaign, of course, wanted to exit the European Union. The Remain side wanted to remain part of the European Union. Now, I just want to kind of bring up certain ways in which the electorate was misled by both sides, but especially by the Leave side. I'll just give you one figure. Before the vote happened, the British people were told that if they exited the European Union, they would be able to save 350 million pounds per week, which could then be channelized into things that the British really wanted to spend their money on, like the National Health Service, which is a very important health service. It is still considered to be one of the best public health service providers in the world. The NHS, which was created in 1949 after the Second World War. Now, again, the reason why I'm bringing this up, this figure, is because this figure was completely false. It was a pack of lies. Okay, this should have been fact-checked. It never was fact-checked. And many people fell for this completely, false figure that was put out by people. Now, again, what I'm bringing up here is that the contentious nature of electoral campaigns means that electorates are told things that have no basis in fact whatsoever. This is just one example of this. There are many, many other examples, but this is the most prominent example. This figure of 350 million pounds that was put forward, and which unfortunately, in my opinion, many people in the UK rather naively accepted. There was no kind of skepticism towards this particular figure that was put forward. Okay. Now, once the referendum had happened and it was decided that the UK would be leaving the European Union, the next set of problems arises. And the next set of problems is in terms of the very hard Brexit that has been experienced. Now, of course, when the Brexit referendum happened, the Prime Minister at the time, a man called David Cameron, he resigned, and the Prime Ministership was taken over by Theresa May. One of the things that Theresa May did was to trigger Article 50 of the EU agreement, okay, which is the mechanism that is used for a country to leave the European Union. Okay. Now, this triggering mechanism, and I don't want to get into too much of the technical details, because essentially my focus in this talk is to look at the ways in which Brexit became something of a political spectacle that many people across the world took a great deal of interest in. So the next thing that happened was that increasingly the UK started moving towards what is called a hard Brexit, a hard exit from the European Union, which meant that they could have chosen to remain within the common market and the customs union. They didn't decide to do that. Why did that happen? Why did Brexit become this kind of a manifestation of why did it assume such a hard form? My own understanding of this is that it has to do with a particular kind of English nationalism. Now, when I talk about English nationalism, I'm not talking about the UK, I'm not talking about Britain. I'm talking about the most important home nation in the UK, the English as against the Scottish and the Welsh and Northern Ireland. There were two sets of grievances that the UK had towards the European Union. One grievance was that the European Union was a supranational entity that was taking sovereignty away from the UK. That was the major grievance. Now, this grievance manifested itself in the form of a series of slogans that were put forward, which in my view were very shallow and hollow slogans. The idea of let's take back control. It was a very famous slogan. In fact, around that time, since you've asked me to kind of explain this, I wrote an article on the Al Jazeera website where I talked about the series of very insipid slogans, what I call vapid verbalizations, that the Brexit campaign was all about. So you had, since you raised this, let's take back control. Then there was the other one, we want our country back. Get Brexit done. That was the slogan that won Boris Johnson the 2019 election and gave him a hefty, I think, 80-seat majority. Now, once again, the reason why I'm raising these slogans or bringing them up is to suggest the shallowness of the whole Brexit campaign. The thing about slogans is that they're just slogans. They're just words with 3 or 4 lines. And they paper over the complexity of the issue. Now, Brexit is an extremely complex thing. It's not easy to effect. But what makes me very worried about something like Brexit is the complexity of the issue is replaced by simplified, simplistic slogans. And many, many people in the electorate fell for these slogans without really understanding the implications of what was being said. And I would hold the Conservative Party largely responsible for misleading people. So to come back to 2 points that I'm trying to push forward in terms of my explanation of Brexit, which is that the narrowness of English nationalism, the idea that the nation state must be reasserted against the supranationalism, the supranational entity that the European Union is, I think is a very futile thing to do, because one reason, and again, the title of my talk is Brexit and Europe. Let me just focus on Europe itself. One of the reasons why the European Union has been created is because of the horrors of the Second World War. The horrors of the Second World War arose because of contending nationalisms. German, Polish, French, of course there was Britain, which kind of stood outside and was allied to the Americans. But what nationalism did in Europe was to literally tear Europe apart. The Second World War, I mean, when in India, when we think about 1940s, we think of our freedom struggle. We think of 42, we think of the Quit India movement. We think of the series of decisions that our political leaders took, which ultimately led to independence in August 1947. Now, in Europe, the remarkable thing is the way in which many people of that generation, many people who are now, in their 80s and 90s, many people who may have died, how they served in the Second World War and how they became very tired by the Second World War. So my point is that in many ways, Brexit is a strange kind of forgetting of history. Because if anything, the European Union was created to eliminate the ravages of narrow nationalism. Now, it was because of that narrow nationalism that Europe was literally at its, different nationalisms in Europe were at each other's sort of course. The most prominent was Nazi Germany and the dominance of Nazi Germany. By 1942, of course, the tide started reversing when you had the Battle of Stalingrad, and Hitler, of course, suffered reverses on the Russian front. And of course, the Russians were advancing from the Eastern Front, and the British and the Americans were advancing from the Western Front. All that is history. And my point is that in the assertion of English nationalism, what the British seem to have forgotten were these lessons of history. And I think it's very important to learn the lessons of history, because it's very famously said that those who forget history are condemned to repeat those very same mistakes. The famous English historian Eric Hobsbawm, who died almost 10 years ago, very famously said that the relationship between nations to their history is a relationship of a heroin addict to the heroin supplier. Because there's always this kind of wallowing in a particular past. And again, I think that's the great mistake that the British are doing. I always thought of them as very clever people because they ruled us for 200 years. And of course, that was a very dark period in our history. And many people have written about the effects of colonization in India, especially, the drain of wealth, as it's called, first talked about by people like Dadabhai Naoroji and so on. But let me not get into that. Let me focus on what I think was the great mistake that the UK made, and which, in my opinion, and I'm sure that many people may disagree with me in this, and I would be very happy to answer questions, that it's leading Britain down a very dangerous path of authoritarianism, especially under someone like Boris Johnson, who's the current Prime Minister. Okay, but let me get back to these points that I'm making about the genuineness of the grievance. Now, why do I say that the grievance behind Brexit was genuine? Well, there's a very simple reason for this. One of these places, or one of the regions of the UK where this grievance was most felt was in the Midlands and the northern England, which became deindustrialized in the decade of the 1980s. Okay. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind that Northern England was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. England was the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution, as a result of which it became the richest country in the world and the foremost leader of the industrialization, much ahead of other countries like Netherlands and Germany and France, and of course the US became a superpower much later. But it was precisely in those regions that were at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution where the effects of deindustrialization were first felt. The closing down of industries, manufacturing industries, the resultant unemployment. Now, there was a tendency on the part of many people to blame this on the European Union. So there was, as I keep saying, genuine discontent in the northern industrial heartlands of England, places like Lancashire and Yorkshire and the Midlands, a little south from the north. There was genuine discontent because the industries had closed down, because there was mass unemployment, because standards of living was stagnating. And, as I said, that's the genuineness. Now, in that sense, the Brexit referendum is very similar to the Trump presidential victory. those of you who followed the Trump presidential victory in 2016 will know that there were some states which were key to the victory of Donald Trump, which kind of flipped to the Democrats again this time when Biden won the elections. These three states were called the Rust Belt states. Okay, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. These are the two states that I immediately recall. Now, again, in these Rust Belt states of America, the industries closed down. As a result of the industries closing down, there was a great deal of white, blue collar discontent. Okay, so the blue collar workers, especially amongst whites, not Latinos and Hispanics or blacks. Now, it's in that sense that I often make a parallel between Brexit and the Trump presidential victory. They are what can be called a certain kind of expression of a genuine grievance. And to that extent, I would have a great deal of sympathy for the political sentiment and grievance that is giving rise to Brexit. My concern arises from the form that it takes. So if one looks at the US, for example, the fact that people voted for Trump, who I personally consider a very dangerous character, a very dangerous politician, given his proclivities to shoot his mouth off and say irresponsible things and take very irresponsible political decisions. And we see the Trump counterpart across the Atlantic in the form of Boris Johnson. There are many similarities between these two politicians in terms of their irresponsible rhetoric, and I'll have a little more to say about that. But I hope I've been able to make as clear as I possibly can what I keep calling the genuineness of the grievance of Brexit. Okay. Now, this brings me again back to the European side. The problem with many people who are not leavers, who say that the UK should remain part of the European Union, is that they do not understand the structural problems of the European Union itself, which are extremely problematic. So the European Union as an institution has certain admirable qualities that I try to talk about in terms of it's trying to draw historical lessons from the Second World War, realizing that nationalism had torn Europe apart. And those nationalisms must not be allowed to do the same again. Now, one aspect of the European Union, or which kind of creates it in the kind of institution or organization that it is a form of economic thinking which is a variant of economic neoliberalism. And this variant of economic neoliberalism is German ordo-liberalism. We all know that Germany is a very powerful and strong economy. It is the most powerful economy in Europe. And the point that I'm trying to bring up here is that if people in the UK had a problem with the European Union, one can understand why they had a problem. The problem was to do with a particular kind of economic thinking that was dominant within the institutions of the European Union. And that economic thinking is what I referred to as a variant of economic neoliberalism, which is called German ordo-liberalism. Okay, now let me also add here that neoliberalism has been the dominant mode of political and economic thinking since the 1970s. This is the kind of economic policy that we are following in India, especially since the liberalization policies of 1991 that were introduced by then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. Okay, so when I talk about economic neoliberalism, I'm suggesting that neoliberalism has been dominant across the world. It takes different forms. In the UK, it takes an Anglo-American form of neoliberalism. Of course, as I said, in Europe and Germany, it takes a slightly different form. So one way in which I'm trying to kind of understand Brexit and the problem that the UK had with the European Union was in terms of contending versions of neoliberalism. Okay, now let me just, for 2 or 3 minutes, try to explain what I understand by neoliberalism. I consider myself as someone who was born in the mid-1970s, and Professor Shiv Prasad considers me young, and I'm say very flattered by that compliment. But neoliberalism was born around the same time that I was born, and I often joke to my students that I hope to outlive neoliberalism because I interpret the current events as the demise or the end of neoliberalism, and I hope to explain this a little more. When did neoliberalism begin? As I said, it began in the 1970s. It is premised on the idea that markets must be allowed to take all the major decisions of a society. Okay, the idea of markets being able to decide, and the kind of extremely influential role that markets have. Okay, my own understanding of neoliberalism is premised upon a very interesting book that I read, and if you would like, I can send the full list of references on which I'm basing my talk today. It's by a very interesting author, Daniel Stedman Jones, who's written a book called Masters of the Universe, Hayek, Friedman, and the Birth of Neoliberal Politics. So the point that Daniel Stedman Jones is making in this book is that notions of neoliberalism, ideas of the dominance of the market, can be traced to a set of thinkers. Okay, the two most prominent are the economist Milton Friedman, who famously said there's no such thing as a free lunch, and the political philosopher August von Hayek, whose most famous book is The Road to Serfdom. Okay, so this was the intellectual basis upon which the edifice of neoliberalism was created. Now, neoliberalism became dominant with the rise of a particular very powerful and influential prime minister in the UK called Margaret Thatcher, who came to power in 1979. And the next year, Ronald Reagan, in 1980, came to power as the president in the US. But if one looks at the actual origin of neoliberalism, it actually goes to Latin America, another 11th September, a 9/11 that most of us tend to forget. Whenever we think of 9/11, we think of 2001, the World Trade Center, and the attacks on the World Trade Center. There was another September 11th that happened in 1973 in the Latin American country, Chile, when a socialist government led by Salvador Allende was overthrown in what is widely agreed to be a CIA and MI6-backed military coup. CIA is, of course, the Central Intelligence Agency, American Intelligence Agency. MI6 is the British security, the intelligence agency. Allende in 1973 was replaced by a very powerful politician called Augusto Pinochet. Chile was the ground in which the supposedly free markets of neoliberalism were ironically rolled out through military jackpots. Look at the irony in this. Free markets being rolled out with the force of military jackboots. It was one of the most repressive regimes in the world. As Pinochet stepped down from power in 1990. If you've been following the news, and I find this very interesting, last Sunday, Chile went into the second round of its presidential elections, electing a young 35-year-old former student leader, someone called Gabriel Boric. And I find this very interesting. And this is why I'm suggesting that we may be witnessing the end of neoliberalism. Because in the very country where neoliberalism began, you have a government that is led by a student leader who is saying that he will bring about the end of neoliberalism. So the explanation of neoliberalism that I'm trying to bring is not confined to the UK. It has a certain kind of a global presence, which is why I go back to my first point. I do not read Brexit as a simply British phenomenon. I look at Brexit as a phenomenon that has global implications, and some of those implications I will try to talk about towards the end of my discussion. I'm keeping track of time, and I'm also mindful of the fact that I would want to hear from people and answer as many questions as I possibly can. So I hope I've been able to make the case for the global significance of Brexit, that it's not just a UK or England phenomenon. One should not, and hence my point that in India, we should be focusing on this much more. This is not just to try to sell my own book or anything of that kind, but just to kind of bring up how important it is for us to take the world more, to look at the world in much more depth, with much more intensity and more insight. So the 70s, as I said, is the decade in which the presence of neoliberalism is established across large parts of the world. Of course, in India, it comes a little later. There's a bit of a lag, almost a 10, 11-year lag before we have neoliberal ideas coming to India. Now, let me come back. I think I've tried to explain what neoliberalism is. I mean, the central emphasis on neoliberalism is the rolling forward of free markets. Now, obviously, the rolling forward of free markets, concomitant to that, associated with that, is the notion that the state should roll itself back. Okay, so you have the rolling forward of the market, you have the rolling back of the state, the idea that the state should not be in the way of markets, that markets should be allowed to take many of the decisions that states were taking, and states tend to do that in a very inefficient sort of a way, and there is a certain efficiency of markets. So this, in many ways, I think sets the stage for something like Brexit in terms of the crisis of neoliberalism itself. Okay, now let me just come back to this point that I was making about the particular region in the UK where maximum Brexit discontent was felt, which is the former northern industrial heartlands, those where deindustrialization happened throughout the 1980s. Okay, the industries were shut down. There were significant job losses, and England, in many ways, the UK is a very divided country. A very famous political scientist, Bob Jessup, has put forward what is called a two-nation thesis. Now, essentially, what Bob Jessup has been arguing since the 1980s is that the UK is actually two countries. You have the prosperous south, so the areas around London, which are very rich and very prosperous, the famous university towns of Oxford and Cambridge. These are the very rich, prosperous parts of the UK. The north seems to be a completely different country altogether, where you have greater levels of poverty, greater levels of unemployment, greater levels of a certain kind of social hopelessness. It's interesting to kind of look at the contrast between these two countries. And what I'm now going to suggest is a bit of an irony, because when it comes to Brexit, the support comes from both these two very disparate parts of the country. So the prosperous, the prosperous financial speculation on which London, by the way, is still the world's leading financial center. Okay, it's far more significant than New York or Frankfurt or Tokyo. There are various reasons for this. Whether it will remain the most significant financial center after Brexit is still to be seen. We don't know the effects of it. But what I'm bringing up here is that the irony of the situation is that a phenomenon like Brexit is supported by the two most disparate ends of the country: the rich, prosperous part of Britain and the poor, deindustrialized, depressed, unemployed part of the UK. This is where the support for Brexit is coming from. Okay, and again, this sounds very strange in the sense that and people have their different reasons for supporting Brexit. Okay, the rich, prosperous parts of the country, which have traditionally voted for the Conservative Party, and the depressed, deindustrialized, poorer, less prosperous parts of the north. Now, let me try to, as I said, try to keep pushing the story forward and try to bring it towards some kind of of culmination before I kind of open things up for question. It's very interesting to see the way in which the blame for the problems of the UK kept being put on the European Union. Now, that's something very convenient. You know, every time a country has a problem, it's very convenient to put the blame on someone else. I mean, that's something we often do as human beings, right? We fail in life, we put the blame on circumstances, we blame our parents or our friends or something of that kind. And I think one of the points about the quote that Dr. Chashri began with, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam's quote, was actually, it's all about taking your own responsibility. That was the significance of the quote that Dr. Chashri read out. So, when it came for the failures of Britain, where Britain was going on, I mean, there are huge structural problems with the British economy. It is still one of the most prosperous economies in the world. But there are, as I keep saying, huge structural problems. Now, there was a tendency to blame those problems on the European Union itself, which is, as I keep saying, very convenient. Now, what disturbs me about Brexit? I'll enter more political terrain now. I mean, I was trying to talk about a certain kind of the economics of Brexit a little while ago. The politics of Brexit, which troubles me, is that Brexit has given rise to a very frenzied, flag-waving patriotism, which I found very disturbing in the UK. Because what I've noticed about Brexit patriotism is that the love of the UK, the love of one's own country, is premised so much on the hatred of European neighbors, which I find very difficult to understand. How can love be premised so much on hatred? And this is a supreme irony. And I've noticed that, I mean, I've been following the negotiations between the UK and the European Union. And I've noticed that the European side has never failed in expressing its Anglophilia, that is, its love for the UK. The European Union Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen, has many times in her speeches expressed her profound love for the UK. I mean, she when the withdrawal agreement happened, she quoted from T.S. Eliot, and let me just read out what she quoted. It was very moving lines. Just give me 1 minute. These are lines from T.S. Eliot that she read out. She said, "What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a new beginning." Then she went on to quote from This is what she said to Britain. I'm quoting from Ursula von der Leyen. Only in the agony of parting do we look into the depths of love. She wanted to say to the UK, we will always love you and will never be far. Now, this was met on the British side with a great deal of hostility, and which is the point that I'm making about Brexit patriotism. How can love for one's country be premised so much on hatred of one's neighbors? Because you've got to live with your neighbors. The famous Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who was also a Roman emperor, once said that one of the important things that we must always do in life is to accept our lot and cast our lot with our neighbors. Now, that's something that Britain never has seemed to reconcile itself to. The distance between Britain and the continent is very small. It's a narrow strip of the English Channel, which it doesn't take too long to cross it. That's what many immigrants have been trying to do to cross the English Channel. The thing about Brexit, and which I find very strange, is that it is premised upon a strange kind of wanting to be closer to the Americans. The Americans are 7 hours away across the Atlantic. And the vast distance of the Atlantic, which takes 7 hours to cross, has often been referred to fondly by the British as the pond. A pond is not a very large body of water. You can easily cross a pond. So the British often refer to the Atlantic as a pond to indicate their proximity to the Americans. When I was trying to understand the phenomenon of Brexit, let me just explain this point, which is why I find Brexit such an anomaly and such an undesirable phenomenon. There is a famous Portuguese novelist called José Saramago, who I find very interesting to read. He's written a book called The Stone Raft. Now, in this book, there is a very imaginative device that he uses in which he suggests that the Iberian Peninsula, which is the part of Europe that Spain and Portugal consist of, and which is separated from the rest of Europe by a mountain range called the Pyrenees, he suggests that it breaks off. It breaks off from the rest of Europe and moves towards the middle of the Atlantic. Now, the Brexit phenomenon is something like that. It is the desire on the part of the UK to break away from the rest of continental Europe and to replace the narrow body of water that the English Channel is with the wider body of water that the Atlantic is. So it arises from a strange kind of love for America, where Britain feels that it can become great once again by riding on the coattails of the Americans. Now, we all know that the relationship with the Americans is always going to be an unequal relationship. The UK has nowhere near the stature of the US. And what I tell a lot of my British friends, especially the ones who are Brexit supporters, is how can you countenance this? How can you actually want a friendship in which you will be the unequal partner and leave behind the European Union, where you will be on a position of parity with the Germans and the French? I mean, if anything, the leading economies in Europe are Germany, France, and Great Britain. And I think that this kind of is a very sad story of Brexit, in the sense that the parity that the UK has with Britain and Germany is being sought to be left behind for this relationship with the US. The way in which this relationship with the US has been described is called the special relationship. Okay, and there's a movie that has been made out of this, and what it represents is the cultural proximity that Britain feels towards America. But again, the reason why I'm bringing this up is to bring out the political sentiment behind Brexit, a sentiment in which continental Europe is viewed as culturally distinct and distant. The point I was trying to bring up is the second political point that I'm trying to make, that my interpretation of Brexit, and many people have made this point, this is not just a point that I'm making, is also arising from a strange, twisted nostalgia for the British Empire. Now, the point that I also made was, before the disconnection happened, was, of course, the British Empire has ended. India and our independence was one of the most significant nails in the coffin of the British Empire. Okay, an entity that was, that has been extremely bad as far as people like us in our part of the world would understand, in terms of the effects of colonization, the drain of wealth, and also the poverty that our part of the world has experienced because of the effects of colonialism. But again, what makes me very wary of Brexit is this pretense to grandeur on especially the part of English nationalism, the desire of wanting Britannia to rule again. And what makes me very surprised about a phenomenon like Brexit, and where again the economic consideration comes up, is that the European Union was Britain's largest trading partner. To actually leave your largest trading partner, to exit it, can only be called an act of, it's not wise. There's a certain kind of lack of economic wisdom when you would want to sever your links with your major trading partner. Now, what Brexiteers have then said is that we want to re-establish connections with the countries of the Commonwealth, which are former members or parts of the empire. Now, in no way can the members of the Commonwealth, in terms of their trade with the UK, replace the European Union. It is considered to be one of the most successful and largest trading arrangements in the world after the Second World War. There have been many trading arrangements. Europe was one of the first one of them. There was LAFTA, the Latin American Free Trade Association. There was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association. In South Asia, we've tried our own version of it, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. But in terms of coming back to the politics of Brexit, I find it surprising that a country can leave behind its major trading partner for the sake of tenuous relationships that it would want to re-establish with former members of the former parts of the empire. That's in terms of, as I said, the second point, the second political point that I'm trying to make here. Let me come to the third political point, which is, it's one of the most centrally discussed concepts in political science, and that is the concept of sovereignty. So Professor Shiv Prasad asked me to kind of say that slogan again, that point about let's take back control. The slogan was all about reasserting a particular notion of sovereignty. Okay, the idea that the sovereignty of the European Parliament could not exceed the sovereignty of the Parliament in Westminster. Now, my own understanding of it is that notions of sovereignty keep changing. In the Brexit referendum, or in the politics of Brexit, the notion of sovereignty that has been appealed to is a dated, antiquated 19th century version of sovereignty. A version of sovereignty whose premises are not available in the interdependent world of the 21st century. Okay, so this notion of sovereignty that Brexiteers are talking about by invoking the slogan, let's take back control, to my understanding, is a notion of sovereignty whose premises are just not available in the 21st century, for the simple reason that nation states will have to cooperate much, much more in terms of confronting the challenges of the 21st century. One of those challenges is, of course, the climate challenge. The COP26 summit happened in the UK, in the Scottish city of Glasgow, a month and a half ago, and I find the politics of Brexit completely out of step with the imperatives and the demands of the 21st century. So my point is that the assertion of sovereignty on the part of Brexiteers is, to my mind, an extremely futile assertion of sovereignty, for the simple reason that Brexiteers seem to be completely out of touch with the realities of the 21st century. Nation states cannot build up big walls and then think that they will be able to prosper. Okay, let me come to my next political point, and this has to do with very recent political developments that have been happening. These political developments have to do with the pandemic itself. Now, we all know that the WHO declared the pandemic in early March 2020. By that time, the UK had already withdrawn from the European Union. The point that I would want to make is that the many ill effects of Brexit on the British economy, and there is by and large a consensus that Brexit has damaged the British economy. But the damage that has been done has in many ways been masked by the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, one way in which, again, Britain and Europe have come into conflict with each other has been over the question of the vaccines that have been developed to kind of eliminate the virus. One of the first vaccines to have been developed was the vaccine developed by Oxford University researchers and the Anglo-Swedish company AstraZeneca, which in India, it's marketed as Covishield, the one that I took, 2 doses of which I've taken. And in many ways, this is the vaccine that has been the most prominent one in the third world. There's, of course, the Pfizer vaccine, which is much, much more expensive. and which is considered to be a little more efficacious in terms of the technology that it uses. But the point that I want to come to is that the pandemic and the development of vaccines has brought up the clash between Britain and Europe, and what Brexit has been all about in terms of exacerbating and worsening that clash. Okay, now the big row that happened between Britain and Europe over the vaccines was the French president Emmanuel Macron in early 2021, I think rather unwisely suggested that the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine was not very effective. That was a false. I mean, it is pretty effective as a vaccine. It has, it has a high efficacy rate. Of course, the Indian Covaxin has been pretty effective as well, and of course, the Bharat Biotech it's recently received emergency use authorization from the WHO. But let me not get into those, those other details. What I want to focus on is how Brexit has led to a worsening and exacerbation of relations between Britain and Europe over the vaccines. Now, the problem with the British response was what has been called vaccine nationalism. I'm sure that many people will be familiar with this particular term. Now, what does vaccine nationalism mean? It means this mistaken belief that many countries have that they can vaccinate their own populations and then be complacent that the virus has gone away. The virus doesn't go away that easily. And this is a mistake that especially the rich, prosperous countries like the US and France and Germany and UK have been making. Okay, the notion of vaccine nationalism. Again, these points that I am making go back to my own larger points about the futility of Brexit itself. I just kind of try to kind of dwell on this particular point to make amplify my larger point about what I think is the foolhardiness of Brexit. Okay, now once again, I mean the fact that the UK was able to develop one of these these early vaccines is a testament to the scientific expertise of the UK, the greatness of its universities, Oxford, of course, being the university where it was developed. The UK is one of those countries which has a huge scientific, expertise and the kind of research that goes into this. But the responses from the politicians was, I thought, very, very strange. One of the things that Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanted to do was to put the Union Jack, which is the famous flag of the UK, on the packaging of the vaccine, which was resisted. Now, I think this is a very shallow form of assertion of one's own pride. Attitudes of this kind do not counter something as serious as the pandemic. Okay, so the big row between the European Union and the UK, in which the European Union also I felt behaved in a very irresponsible sort of a way, because it actually threatened to invoke Article 16 of the protocol, which is it's a complex technical thing. I mean, if people want, I can try to explain this, but it has huge implications for trade relations between the UK and Europe. But the standoff between Britain and the European Union was a very bitter standoff over the vaccines, because the European side kept complaining that it did not get its fair share of the vaccines from AstraZeneca, which is an Anglo-Swedish company. It's jointly owned by the British and the Swedish. Okay, on this whole point about vaccine nationalism, I think the most sensible things have been said by two people. One is the famous South African epidemiologist Karim Abdul Salim. He's the South African counterpart of Anthony Fauci, who many of us may know. And the point that Karim Abdul Salim made was that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Until every single person on the globe is vaccinated, none of us is safe. Even if we've had double doses or triple doses, and some countries have been going in for 4 doses. I mean, Israel is one country which has been suggesting that it will go in for a 4th dose for its citizens. So once again, what I'm bringing up here is that I interpret Brexit as an extremely insular nationalistic phenomenon, and this is manifest in terms of the immature way in which the British talked about the AstraZeneca vaccine and how it wanted to claim a certain kind of British pride. In fact, there were certain British politicians who actually made this claim that we're just a better country, and the British vaccine rollout was much more successful than the European rollout of the vaccine. And I think the British were far more successful on that count. But the responses from politicians in Britain, I thought, were extremely immature. And it just goes to show that most of the time politicians can be very immature in the way that they respond. So, as I said, this was in terms of what I call the futile assertion of a certain sovereignty, and manifesting itself in this particular form of vaccine nationalism. Again, one person who I consider very wise in the world is Pope Francis, who every time he speaks makes a great deal of sense to me. Last year, in his Orba et Orbi address, as it's called, Pope Francis famously said that the narrow walls of nationalism cannot keep the virus out. And again, this was something that Brexit politicians did not seem to understand. They thought that they could vaccinate their own populations and that they would be safe. One reason why the Omicron variant has emerged is because it's emerged from Gauteng province in South Africa. One reason for this could be that South Africa is one of the least vaccinated continents in the world. Latin America is the most vaccinated continent. If the richer countries in the world had shared their vaccines with poorer parts of the world like Africa, perhaps that could have prevented the virus from mutating. And again, many epidemiologists are making this point. The point being that if the richer countries do not share their vaccines with poorer countries, the virus will go on mutating and the pandemic will go on prolonging. Now, this is a point that countries like India, South Africa have been making in terms of waiving the patent for the vaccine. Richer countries like the US, UK, and Germany have been resisting this. But again, I don't want to get into that. I want to move on to my next and my larger point in terms of, and this will be the last one that I will make after which I will open things up. Why do I consider Brexit to be so dangerous? I'll make 2 points, and as I said, end. What Brexit has revealed is the very real possibility of the very union of the UK breaking apart. Okay, the United Kingdom is a union of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It is considered to be a very successful union. Now, if Brexit goes ahead, the possibilities of Scottish independence become much, much, much more pronounced. 7 years ago, in 2014, the Scottish held a referendum in which they narrowly agreed to stay within the United Kingdom. With Brexit, the Scottish would want to side with the European Union, and which would mean Scottish independence. So my larger point and very blunt point is, ironically, Brexit could mean the very dissolution of the United Kingdom. Okay, this would be a very ironical state of affairs were it to play it out, and which is why I consider it to be such a bad idea. My next point, and I will try to make this my last point, is Brexit represents Britain going down a dangerously authoritarian path, a path which could mean the end of liberal democracy itself. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because if you look at the series of decisions that the Home Minister Priti Patel has taken, she is one of the most authoritarian Home Ministers. Recently, they've been trying to push a policing bill which will make protesting on the streets almost a criminal offense. It will be hedged in with so many conditionalities that the right to assemble peacefully, which is considered to be one of the most central aspects of modern liberal democracies, will become contested. So what we will see is Britain increasingly going down a more authoritarian path. And I can see that happening in the way that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been leading his political party. Of course, his popularity ratings have been going down. The opposition Labour Party has now opened up a kind of a lead in the polls. The economy is doing pretty badly. In terms of finally kind of trying to sum the whole thing up, let me just kind of sum it up in perhaps 3 points. And as I said, I will then be very interested in hearing the questions that people have. The problem with Brexit is its assertion of sovereignty, an outdated, antiquated, archaic notion of sovereignty, which belongs to the 18th century, 19th century, not the 21st century. The second problem with Brexit is its assertion of the narrowness and insularity of the nation state, a nation state which cannot confront the challenges and problems of the 21st century. Let me just mention 2 of those. One of those, of course, is the coronavirus pandemic and climate crisis. These are crises that transcend the boundaries of nation states. Nation states will have to come together to be able to confront these problems. The third and last point is the whole question of how Brexit will become an inherently authoritarian project, a project premised upon the denial of hitherto well-established civil liberties for its citizens. It's just 7 minutes past 12 o'clock. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Amir, for a beautiful talk, a very nice, enthusiastic presentation, and giving a wide picture of why this happens. And what was more interesting to see, I mean, I also agree with you that it's completely a global phenomenon, though it looks very localized to this, because this story can be told of every nation in the country, right? Including America. You mentioned America, it can be India, it can be France, it can be, I mean, all sorts of places. This is a phase of maybe is it a consequence of the liberal democracy which we're talking about? Because the consequence leads to the liberalize, or what we in physics we call it as delocalization of democracy, right? So in this process of modern liberal democracy, I mean, I don't agree with it, but it's just a thought which comes in my mind. That I mean, we are trying to make every nation equal, everybody equal in that kind of a liberal democracy, and so the identity crisis of people becomes important. It's just start thinking, my God, I'm losing something which was so valuable to me, or which I thought is very important in my life, and so is that leading to some sort of this kind of localization of thoughts everywhere in the nation. And you mentioned about a couple of reasons. One was the economic reasons, especially the unemployment of different regions of the world, etc., is one of the reasons. And the other is the neo-economic liberalization of whether that also created this kind of a problem. And then the third one, probably, which I thought was ignored a little bit, is the Islamic terrorism, which became a universal phenomenon. Right. And then the fear that this kind of a terrorism, we need strong leaders, we need our own thing, that kind of a feeling also probably brought in this. Probably it's also one part of the story. So how do you comment on these things?
Well, I mean, actually, a lot of what you said actually, would be things that I largely agree with. In fact, the first point that you made was actually, kind of stealing the words from my mouth. I mean, it's a point that I was about to make. Let me begin with your last point. This point about strong leaders, which I'm very intrigued by, because suddenly the world seems to have become beholden to the idea of a strong leader, as if the strong leader will wave a magic wand and all the problems will go away. I don't think that strong leaders are very effective in terms of countering the problems of the world. I mean, look at Mr. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. The way that Brazil has handled its pandemic has been terrible. Mr. Trump, in terms of the high death rate, Mr. Johnson in the UK has completely mishandled the situation. So I think the great falsehood that electorates seem to have been served is that strong, decisive leaders will be able to solve the problems of countries. So one of the reasons why in 2019 Mr. Johnson won that huge mandate, I mean, 80-seat majority is big in a country like the UK. Is because he appeared to be very decisive. And his slogan was, I'm going to get Brexit done. Now, beyond that, no one knows what it means. How will you get Brexit done? It's a much, much more complex phenomenon than that. So this notion of strong leadership, I think, is perhaps one of the most dangerous ideas that is predominant across the world. If anything, I think it's the women leaders across the world who have been most successful. I mean, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, the Taiwanese president, the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin. The women leaders have shown much greater.
Or even Merkel, right? For example,
Angela Merkel, yes. I mean, I forgot to mention Angela Merkel. I mean, I think women leaders have shown greater empathy, care in terms of solving the problem. And I don't think it's any accident that countries that have been led by women leaders have handled the pandemic much better than countries that have been led by strong, powerful male leaders. I mean, what have they been able to do apart from this rhetoric, which I find very hollow and very shallow? Let me come to your first point, which I think I completely agree with you, that Brexit is also a reaction to globalization and the flattening processes of globalization, because it seems to create the whole world the same. I mean, you go to any airport in the world, it looks the same. You go to any shopping mall across the world, it looks the same. I mean, on the JNU campus, I live across these fancy shopping malls, and every time I go to them, it all looks the same brands, the same kind of shopping. It's strange the way the world is being cast in one image, and I think that's wrong. And therefore, Brexit can in many ways be understood as a reaction to people who are left behind by globalization. And I think that's also happened in India. In India, we've had a certain rising tide of globalization that has carried the middle class, the consuming middle class. A political scientist called Leela Fernandez, some 15 years ago, wrote a book called The New Indian Middle Class. Okay, this new consuming class, which lives in fancy apartments in Delhi suburbs like Gurgaon and Noida, and I'm sure in Bangalore and other cities in the south, you have that phenomenon. But then there are also people who've been left behind by globalization, okay, for no fault of theirs. So Brexit in many ways is arising from people who've been left behind by globalization. The rising tide of globalization has not lifted every single boat. Some boats have been left stranded and some boats have been sunk. And I think this is really the problem. And therefore, the world has to rethink the very process of globalization itself. One further point in terms of democracy, which I perhaps should have said a little more. I consider democracy to be a concept that is in danger right now. There are a series of political scientists who have written on the death of democracy. And those books are sitting right on the shelf. You won't be able to see it, but right next to me here. So the two Harvard political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Stephen Ziblatt, have written a book called How Democracies Die. An Australian political theorist has written a book called The Death of Democracy. Recently, an American Polish journalist has written a book called The Twilight of Democracy. And I think as political scientists, since I'm talking to fellow colleagues, teachers in political science, we must realize that democracy is in danger. And I think the reason why democracy is in danger is I think perhaps political scientists need to put the blame on. We need to take the blame. We've always sung these hymns of glory to democracy. Democracy is great. Of course, democracy is great. But what makes democracy translate into empowerment for people? I mean, what is democracy? Democracy is when people are able to take or have a say in decisions that will affect them. Democracy is not just elections. Democracy also entails a process of democratization. So the concept of democracy and the process of democratization. The reason why democracy is in crisis is that it's just the concept of democracy that has been focused on. The process of democratization has not been focused on as much as it should be. What has also happened to democracy is what I can only call a caricaturing of democracy. Now, we all know what a caricature is. It is a representation in which one part of the human body, usually the head, is overrepresented. Now, the caricaturing of democracy has been the excessive emphasis on elections. Democracy is not just about contesting and winning elections. Of course, that is one part of it. But my worry is that this kind of caricaturing of democracy, this overemphasis being placed on elections, what it's doing is it's killing off the rest of democracy. I mean, in exactly the same way, for example, if there's a malignant cancerous cell in the body, a cancer is when there's a proliferation of one part, a few cells in the body. It kills off the rest of the organism. I think the current preoccupation, fixation, obsession with elections is going to kill off democracy completely. It holds for many of the things that I said about the Brexit referendum, and also the way that elections, for example, in our country are considered, and for that matter, in many other parts of the world, in the US. So I hope I've been able to respond to all of your 3 points.
Yes.
Professor.
Amir Ali sir, this is K.R. Bharat here.
Hi.
I was wondering whether you could bring in some more issues like that the leadership of European Union was slipping away from England's hand because most of the monopoly decisions were being taken by Germany and France was dominating. The classical clash between France and
England
was one of the issues for why they have to leave.
Yeah.
And the agricultural subsidy and labor issues were major reasons for Brexit issue to come up in England.
Yeah.
I think if you could highlight those things, it would have been wonderful presentation, sir.
Because I completely agree with you, and I realized that I missed those parts of it. I mean, as far as the British role in Europe is concerned, it's always been this kind of a reluctant role. The Paris-Berlin axis has always been the dominant player in Europe, and as I said, I completely agree with you that there was the dominance of the British and the Germans and the French, and of course that famous rivalry. Yes, a lot of it has to do with agricultural subsidies and the common agricultural policy, which has been a very central part of the European Union. But my own interpretation of this is slightly different, and let me put it forward. And my interpretation of it would be that, of course, it's arising from what you just said, that point about the Germans and the French dominating. But there's something more to it, and that something more to it is two things. Firstly, a greater cultural affinity with the Americans. The Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-American cultural affinity and the pull that the UK feels from across the Atlantic, which seems to be stronger than the pull from across the English Channel on the continent. And the second part of this is what I did mention, but which I perhaps did not expand enough, which you have very rightly pointed out to, is the different variants of neoliberalism that these countries agree in. I mean, it's the German ordo-liberalism that is dominant within the European Union. Now, one aspect of German ordo-liberalism is that it places much greater emphasis on regulation in the economy. The British variant of neoliberalism, or the Anglo-American variant of neoliberalism, places much greater emphasis on a lack of regulations. So one aspect of Britain has been a low tax regime, less regulatory mechanisms when it comes to environment, less regulatory mechanisms on health and safety. So in addition to the points about the clash over agricultural subsidies, I think at heart it is to do with different understandings of neoliberalism itself, and the German emphasis and the dominance of the Germans, as you very rightly pointed out too. But if I were to kind of pinpoint what is the specific aspect of that difference, it would be, to my mind, these differences in variants of neoliberalism that I'm talking about. The Anglo-American variant of neoliberalism that makes the UK more proximate to the US, and German ordo-liberalism that brings the Germans and the French on this other side. If I can quickly add, again, something I wasn't able to bring up. If there is one reason why Brexit has happened, it is to do because of a series of think tanks on the British and the American side. They have, over the years, put forward policy papers and position papers that have been arguing for Brexit. So the think tanks that I have in mind, on the American side are the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Foundation, the Heritage Foundation. On the British side is the Adam Smith Institute, the Center for Policy Studies, some others. So, I mean, if one looks at the back history of Brexit, one can see that these think tanks, which are premised on what I call the Anglo-American variant of neoliberalism, have been for the last 25, 30 years arguing for this kind of eventuality of Brexit. And they've also been advocating a free trade agreement between the British and the Americans. With Biden's victory, of course, he doesn't seem to be that interested in a free trade agreement. I mean, Brexit would have made greater sense if Trump had continued in the White House. But the fact that Trump was voted out has in many ways massively wrong-footed Brexit politicians. That would be my interpretation of those points. That, as I said, I completely agree with you, and I think I slightly missed out on.
Another small thing, Bharat, is probably UK in some sense was never fully into Brexit, right? When they
absolutely
the euro, they did not take
that's right. That's right.
Becoming the euro, right? So
yeah,
I mean, there was always this hesitation, probably.
Their heart was never in it. Their heart was never in the project, and I think it has to do with a certain notion of English exceptionalism, the idea that it's in some way different from Europe, and that its destiny is tied with more distant corners of the world, and therefore the Commonwealth, the empire, comes back as a theme in Brexit. So yes, their heart was never set on it, and I think when your heart is never set on things, they were pulled in two different directions. One, of course, was the American direction, and the other, of course, was to the distant corners of other parts of the world. And they've always considered themselves to be, this kind of swashbuckling, enterprising country that can conquer the shores. If you've noticed one thing, that the UK is now focusing on Asia Pacific as a major region. So there's that big trade agreement with Japan and Australia that they are really interested in. Again, to bring up the strange anomaly of Brexit is that it arises from two contradictory tendencies. There is a narrow Little England tendency of the little English villages, the sleepy English, the churches, and the green cricket grounds. And then you have this world-beating idea of England conquering the world. So these two very strangely contradictory tendencies are at the heart of it. And yes, you're right. Their heart was never in the European project in the first place.
That because of the open space, that there was a huge migration of laborers into the England who are ready to work for cheap labor. That is also one of the triggering factor for these labor unions to oppose this and support the Brexit, sir. That is my understanding of what I have been reading about these things. I would like to know your comments and suggestions on that, sir.
I agree with you on the first part of it. I mean, certainly the immigration did trigger this. The opposition, I don't think, has come so much from the labor unions, but more from a certain kind of antipathy towards immigrants. This is what really concerns me about Brexit. I mean, it's based on an unfounded hatred of immigrants. I mean, if anything, immigrants have really helped the British economy. I think it's more to do with politicians like Nigel Farage, if you've heard of him, formerly from the UK Independence Party, then he formed the Brexit Party. The triggering mechanism, I mean, yes, immigration was there. But the trade unions, which have traditionally been labor supporting, and the Labour Party has faced a strange kind of crisis. It has just not known what position to take on Brexit. And this explains why Labour did so badly under Jeremy Corbyn in the 2019 elections. So I think it was played up, to my mind, less by the the labour unions, and more by, politicians who bait, who immigrant hatred. So the right-wing sections of the Conservative Party, sections of working class England, which are hostile to immigration. It was always opposed. Brexit was always opposed in the big university towns. I mean, apart from Oxford and Cambridge, all the other universities, Liverpool, Manchester, Southampton, Reading, Warwick, wherever you had major university towns, it's been opposed. One thing I forgot to completely mention, now that you've kind of raised it, I think it also has been triggered by the brutal austerity measures that 11 years of Conservative government have enforced on Britain. Austerity policies that have been put in place since 2010. Now, what these austerity policies have done is that they have significantly reduced expenditure on social housing, on social security, on public transportation. And there is a Warwick University economist, Timo Fetzer, who's written a very convincing paper on this. And his suggestion is, you might want to have a look at this, I can send you the reference, that actually it was austerity that kind of reinforced the triggering mechanism of immigration. So because of the deleterious effects of austerity measures, Brexit happened. And he kind of, he traces this, almost kind of correlates the effects of austerity, Dr. Bhushan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay. You're mentioning about the death of democracy, the fear of becoming more vibrant, in the sense that because democracy is not perfect, it is its own limitations, but because of lack of alternative, we accept democracy as the best one to do, and especially the liberal democracy, etc. But probably what's happening is those limitations of democracy keep showing up once in a while, and then you get these kind of phenomena which happens somewhere where people start thinking, well, let's give it a chance, right? So there's no harm in doing that, right? So I think that kind of a movement is also there, probably, but probably if they don't find it useful, they may come back. I mean, I think we have seen that happening in India many times, and probably even in India, which is not really such a literate nation, but still it's happened several times. And I'm sure this is happening in a more literate country like England. They're also thinking maybe it's nice to become our own, or something like that. So I would not call this as a democracy. I mean, unless they become really authoritarian and start putting brakes on democracy, etc. Unless the system starts actually doing that. As long as elections are there, I strongly believe that democracy will play a role, and probably it's becoming more vibrant with these thoughts. This is my personal view. We can comment on that. Yeah, please.
I have my slight disagreement with that. I mean, as I said, I don't think the elections are the only component of democracy. My big worry about democracy right now, and this would hold true of India, it would hold true of the US and also the UK, is that the electoral component of democracy, I think, is being exaggerated and played up too much. Britain is certainly becoming very authoritarian. I mean, I haven't visited Britain for some years now because of the pandemic and all that. I mean, I had planned to visit in 2020 when I was writing the book, but that was thwarted because of the pandemic. But from what I've been reading and sort of what I've been hearing from friends, I mean, there is certainly a certain authoritarian streak. Johnson he's a very irresponsible character, the Prime Minister, because he doesn't seem to care for the consequences. I mean, he's a typical example of a populist. Now, the Brexit is an example of populism. Now, what is populism? I mean, a lot of populism arose in Latin America, 1960s, the Peronistas in Argentina. The populism that we have right now in the world is a very strange creature because it is characterized by a series of anti-something stances. So it's anti-intellectual, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-foreigner, anti-outsider. It's very, very exaggeratedly pro-people. And when it becomes exaggeratedly pro-people, what it does is, and these are the words of the very famous political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who in 1951 wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And the point that she makes is that when totalitarianism begins, there's an alliance between the mob and the powerful man. That's what you see in the UK. So there's almost a kind of a Brexit mob that Mr. Johnson is trying to kind of mobilize. And this is why I'm reminded of those lines from that 1951 work by Hannah Arendt, who's a very famous political philosopher. And this is what makes me very concerned. This kind of a rousing of the people into a mob and the attempt by a populist leader to stoke the mob. And to the extent that Boris Johnson has undermined Parliament. In 2019, he tried to prorogue Parliament to prevent a discussion of his withdrawal agreement bill the UK Supreme Court intervened successfully and said and overruled Johnson's decision. So when it comes to democracy, I think democracy, the success of democracy happens with the combination of a number of things. I mean, apart from elections, there's a free press. And we are seeing across the world that the press is no longer as free as it was at one time. Social media has played a very important role in this regard. The second is in terms of an independent judiciary. We noticed increasingly that judiciaries across the world are not as independently assertive as they once were. Thirdly, other institutions, like election commissions, for example, must be able to assert, themselves. So whenever these institutions come under a cloud, the media, the Supreme Courts, higher legislatures, and other autonomous constitutional bodies, you can be pretty sure that you have a perfect crisis of democracy brewing. And you can see all that happening, not just in our country, but in many, many other countries of the world, which is what makes me very pessimistic about the prospects of democracy. Of course, we will have another version of democracy, as you said. It will be forged. It will come back, perhaps in a more robust sort of a way, more kind of much stronger than the liberal democracy that we have.
I believe so. Yeah.
Well, on that, I would be as optimistic as you are. Gramsci's famous quote is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So that's a combination, I think.
Great. Thanks, Amir Ali, Dr. Amir Ali. It was a beautiful talk.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I enjoyed the whole thing, and probably it was very thought-provoking and several things to think about. I mean, very interesting. Now,